Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. Radical Engagements at Varn Blog. And I am discussing Yasha Levine's We All Live in the Vampire Castle now from his Substack Nefarious Russians. I've known Yasha's work since his early associations around Radio War Nerd, and friend of the show and my personal friend JG Michael informed me of his work probably 5 or 6 years ago. I started following him on Twitter recently because he started talking about Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle and also how some of it's become very deeply embarrassing, while other parts of that work were highly perceptive. Yasha shared with me this article, and actually, I started reading his Substack somewhat religiously after he shared with me this article on X. Nay Twitter. I'm just going to start referring to it as X, nay Twitter, because that's funny. For those of you who don't get the joke, nay is how you used to refer to someone's maiden name back in those old patriarchal days. But I wanted to also revisit the Mark Fisher essay. I tried to do this in an episode on David Smalls. I have removed the episode at the request of my original guest and also the David Smalls Society in the UK. I won't go into that. There's nothing that I said in that episode that I don't think is true, but I do see the concerns, and I do not want to sound like I'm belittling Smalls' work when my concern was actually Fisher. But I do want to revisit Fisher's work. I have recently discussed Democracy is Joy and some other late Fisher writings that I thought actually showed a really unfortunate degeneration in his thought. Whereas there are elements of his thought on the spectacular, on the subjective experience of the spectacular. I mean, he was primarily a media critic applying Marxist and other theories, Derrida, a few melange of left and post-Marxist theories missing with Marxism. Fisher was inconsistent, and when I knew him, on what his relationship to Marxism actually was. But there's a couple of things that I objected to even when we published the Vampire Castle essay at North Star. You can't find it on the North Star website anymore because the North Star website's taken down. And the responses by Jody Dean, then Michael Reckenwald, who is now von Mises in caucus libertarian nationalist who pushes all sorts of quasi conspiracy theories. Sam Chris, who retracted his criticism of Fisher, and myself, who had who I published part of my criticism of Fisher there, that he threw the baby out with the bathwater on the issues of identity within the working class. And then later on, I fleshed out in a series of podcasts over about 10 years, because now this article is quite old. We're dealing with something I helped publish 12 years ago. That there are elements of Fisher's class understanding which were more rooted in either a British or a Bedouin sense of class as habitus, classes where you're from, and that is where he kind of misidentified the trajectory of Russell Brand, which also, I said at the time, I understand defending Russell Brand in the specific context, but the generic defense of Russell Brand was not something I was willing to do, for the very reason that you can't control how these celebrities develop when they are just kind of talking off the cuff, and any working class coding that they do is from their upbringing, not where they currently are. I mean, you just have to see Russell Brand stuff on the Rumble to see that it's more of a cultural pastiche of working class concerns than he has any relationship to being a laborer. But nonetheless, I think we do have to deal with what is good in Fisher's work too, and I think there was a lot of good in Fischer's work. Capitalist Realism is not a book that I think all of it stands the test of time. And it was very concerned on media and movies in a way that has been forgotten when people discuss it. Like, the first article was about Children of Men. And people zoom in on his reappropriations of Zizek, who is reappropriating Jameson, who is reappropriating other theorists. And what Fischer had a gift for, a really true gift for, was consolidating different theorists and applying them to media and popular culture, and then going out from there. I think, unfortunately, this probably led him to make some pretty big mistakes on analyzing where the political futures really were and how viable the Social Democratic Party he increasingly put his hope in, not just politically, but even personally into. I mean, that's one of the valences of his writing. Now I'll stop there because I do not want to get into psychological speculation on Fischer. I did know him, but I did not know him well. It's not like we were separated by massive amounts of space. When he wrote the piece for North Star, I was in Mexico and he was in London, and our correspondent who connected us was the late Paul Shetler, who used to edit at North Star under the name Pavel. Often people thought that Pavel was me, that I had two positions at North Star, which is actually quite funny. But nonetheless, Shetler's own political trajectory was right-wing. He had been interested in the French New Left in the 90s, but he had become very radicalized towards the left and was a participant in Occupy, was a big pusher of understanding various left-wing movements, and worked with us and the North Star on those grounds. But partly the response to Fischer, particularly up into and until Fischer's death, pushed Shetler further and further away from even Fischer's politics. And he began thinking that a conservative movement would be where workers' identities and workers' concerns could be addressed. Although he worked for many different governments as a tech consultant after he left the North Star, which was just a hobby for him. Now, I give you all this background because it's not commonly known. Matt Calhoun and the people over around Zero and Repeater, who were Fischer's advocates, do know a whole lot about him that I don't know. I will totally admit that. But they haven't ever really discussed this context for this essay. And I think, that has limited our ability to understand all the concerns that we were thinking about when we published it, our critiques of it. And there were many internal critiques of the Fischer piece, even at the North Star. We just thought its intervention was important. And then after that initial prairie fire went out, because it almost crashed their site several times, the piece was brought back up a lot of times, in the rise of the dirtbag left around 2016, 2017, almost 5 years after this happened, and primarily after Fischer's death. You started seeing people like Amber Ailey and other people associated with Jacobin Magazine talk about the piece. Sam Criss retracted his initial criticism of Fischer's piece, etc., etc. For me, and this is why I want to go into Lavine, for a long time, the Vampire Castle essay was something I was proud of publishing. Then for many years, I was ashamed of it because it was deeply misunderstood and decontextualized, and people didn't seem to understand what was going on. And particularly the parts about Russell Brand, which I was concerned with at the time, felt more and more embarrassing given Brand's politics, particularly shifting after Fischer's death. But Lavine has singled in on something very important vitally important, and I want to talk about it and read this article. And I'm going to do a couple of pieces by Lavine. I think Yasha's work is actually quite good. Let's get into this. What do the kids say on TikTok? We need to talk about it. We don't need to talk about everything. Come on. Also, parasocial relations aren't talking. But whatever. The youth can do what they want to do. It's each generation has their stupid, insincere call signs. So, but that's part of the point here, isn't it? Let's get into it. We all live in the vampire castle. Revisiting Mark Fisher's essay by Yasha Levine. This is from June. He shared it with me a couple weeks ago, and I wish I'd read this at the time. So definitely check out the Nefarious Russians. Also check out the podcast. I really like their podcast. Right. I've been working on something about the politics of the internet, about how the structural forces built into this technology have worked to pacify people and have foreclosed the possibility of political movement by turning everything into entertainment. I think that this is a very valid point. I don't even think Yasha would disagree with my one caveat here, that this was already happening in subcultural movements tied to music, authenticity, etc. So if you look at the history of the 20th century, recapitulating and capturing radical movements by turning them into entertainment is something that's extremely old. Hell, it comes up in the movie Network in the 1970s, and it was already old then. The radical ends of the youth movement were turned into nostalgia for baby boomer cultural products, etc., etc., etc. That's not new, but it was structurally tied into the internet, particularly by the time you get to Internet 2.0. I don't think the internet had to go this way, but this was always the most likely way it was going to go. And I think Yasha is absolutely right about that, partly because the culture was already doing it before the internet really took off. All right, back to this. This essay has grown in size and has gone through all sorts of directions. So I'm going to break it up into a few smaller pieces and publish it over the next 2 weeks. And I'm going to come back to these series of essays series of essays that Yasha's writing. To start with, I want to bring back Mark Fisher's infamous essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which is why I'm here. It's almost been 12 years now since he wrote this essay. Yep. Which was about a toxic and destructive political culture that had appeared in left-wing circles on the back of social media technologies. I think that's absolutely true, although I do think one of the other points that Fischer had was that this had been a problem on campuses going all the way back to the 1970s. Like when I had talked to Fischer in emails, that is what he brought up. That this was not new, but it had become more and more pernicious, and the social media technologies had allowed a campus culture where this stuff could be embarrassing, but not really debilitating to left-wing movements until, some right-winger pointed to it, to spread out to the general culture in a completely new way. I mean, you got to look at the way that college cultural codes swept into fandoms on Tumblr to really see what the structure of this technology did, because you had a lot of underemployed graduate students after the Great Recession and the late aughts and early aught teens who had picked up a lot of the stuff and were writing about it and influencing 14-year-olds. Anyway, one of the core traits of this new formation was to viciously attack people inside your own camp, to strip down and counsel people for perceived transgression. I mean, we were calling it call-out culture in 2012, but yes. For saying the wrong thing, for not being pure enough, for having too much privilege. And again, I would say all these were pretty common on campuses because they were a way that political subcultures and young people assert power is by dominating their social group by this methodology. And I think that was part of what Fischer said. But what he was implying, although he hadn't really gotten to all this, he was really talking about how it affected Occupy Wall Street in the UK, but that this was seeping into online political subcultures deeply. I don't think it was new. I mean, this is maybe something where Yasha and I may disagree. I just have to talk to him more or read more of these essays. Because I think Yasha's right that there is something about the structure of the internet that made this unable to spill out of campuses and these subcultures and become a dominant cultural force for a very little while. Not for a long while. We'll come back to that too. The other thing I would say before I finish this essay, that the response to Obama and the criticisms of the Democrats is part of why the ruthless critique of the left was so important to people, because they saw themselves as critiquing other elements of the left, often dominated by an Obama administration, which a lot of people had seen as super hopeful, but was failing them around 2011, 2012, even though they would get back on the train for his reelection campaign against Romney. Right. As Fischer pointed out, the people engaged in this new politics were usually atomized and lacked any connection to each other in the real world. Yep. Instead, their group identity was built around virtue signaling, online gang stalking, mobs, and spectacle. I would say that Fischer would also have said this about campuses and about activist movements before the rise of the internet, but that it's the rise of the internet makes this a really dominant thing. It's all about tearing people down. A kind of macabre entertainment, in the ignorant and malicious mob justice against people who were or could have been comrades, people who were on your side. Fischer was deeply depressed by the emergence of this toxic culture, and that he considered exiting politics altogether, multiple times actually, and he did eventually exit. I mean, he was very quiet after what happened with Syriza. To him, this wasn't politics; it was anti-politics. 2 years later, he killed himself. I mean, yeah, the Corbyn, what happened. I don't want to know how. Sometimes I'm very interested to know how he would react and what we've seen with Corbyn, both within the labor movement and now in his own party flaming up very quickly. But the last few years of Fischer's life, he was a lot quieter. And I do think, I don't know this, but I do think it is interesting that, like, if you follow his blog, for example, right before he dies, you can feel him writing a lot about Syriza and seeing, what happened with Syriza really go south. All right. Fischer's essay ended up being very formative to a lot of people on the American left who were just coming of age in the Obama years and Occupy Wall Street. Yep. And he was partly writing about Occupy Wall Street, so that makes sense. People inside the DSA and the Bernie movement reread his essay and took what Fischer worked to heart. You can't build a political movement if you're constantly policing each other for perceived microaggressions and counseling each other for stupid or offensive things you said online. And I think for all the problems of the dirtbag left, and there are many, including their failure to really leave the Democrats, they were right about that. Politics is trying to work together. It's about talking to people and finding things you have in common with each other. To build a left movement, you need to focus on material issues that matter to people. It was a basic truth that Fischer had pinpointed so very well, and it served as a guiding light to a totally depoliticized generation being raised on memes and flame wars. And, their following generation is pure memes and flame wars, and their politics are hard to predict, and they seem very inchoate. Not non-political, but indescribably ideologically political. We'll get to that when it goes to Zoomers, because a lot of people think this is new, but this was also common in Gen X. Anyway, you could say that the Vampire Castle essay was the equivalent of a communist manifesto to a big chunk of the Bernie movement, and a lot of people tune their social media messaging to reflect Fischer's critique. Yeah, but they did, 3 years after we published the essay. By this point, I mean, I have been canceled. Ironically, the one almost successful attempt to cancel me happened after the Vampire Castle essay. And I was partly at fault. I mean, I'm not gonna lie about that. I got very frustrated with someone coming at me for misgendering someone I had only known as a man, who they attached a picture to, and that picture showed no difference in gender. And I later on discovered that the person had declared themselves non-binary. And I was like, how can I know that? There's nothing performative in this picture to tell me that they've done that. And I have not kept up with this person. and I got dogpiled and I got mad and I said something kind of reactionary, like, I'll call anybody, but any pronoun they want to use if I know to do that. Um, but including it, which was the wrong thing to say. But I got called a transphobe for years for that. And to be honest, I didn't understand that movement. I still don't know that I understand everything on that issue. I try to present um, that issue as best as I can. Um, and I have investments there, but and that people close to me have actually worked on scientific papers on the issue. But as far as I'm concerned, I was kind of in the wrong, but the response to me was very thick. And then the accusations started spinning from there. So people read through my articles and found where I had mentioned genetics and anthropology and talked about how that made the concept of race incoherent. And they used the fact that I mentioned genetics at all to say it was a race realist, which was the opposite point that I was making. And this happened after the Fischer piece. It wasn't directly connected to the Fischer piece, but at the time I had a partner who was suffering from cancer, and I was living in Egypt, and it just didn't seem worth it to me anymore. So I stopped blogging. I let myself my podcast get bought by then Zero Books 2.0 Doug Lane, a person who I'd worked with in the past at his early version of Diet Soap, and I became a much less public figure for several years. And unfortunately, it was kind of probably bad for my bottom line, if I'm honest, or at least for like this educational project, because I did this during the height of the explosion of left podcasting. And I've been doing left podcasting since 2011, but could not benefit from this boom. But you know what? I'm probably better off for it, because let's be honest, the incentives for media are terrible. And that's part of what Yasha is getting at here. All right, back to Yasha. They tried to drop identity politics and focused on core class issues that mattered to most Americans: wages, work conditions, cost of living, healthcare. Asterisk, they did, although their focus was very much on the versions of that affected downwardly mobile, middle class, white collar workers. They did, talk about work conditions, but it was never in the forefront. Wages was kind of in the forefront, but the biggest ones was cost of living, which affects everybody, healthcare, etc. Now, even on cost of living, there was some denials in those circles about the threat of inflation. But anyway, I get Yasha's point, and it's broadly true. I have to nuance it. It's what I do. And that was good. But looking back on it now, I think both Fischer and the left that he inspired avoided dealing with a much bigger issue that was only hinted at but loudly implied in his essay. Bingo. Bingo, bingo, bingo. This is something that Yasha himself got me rethinking about this essay, but it also was part of problem with Fischer himself, because who Fischer was defending, Russell Brand, was a media figure. And the spectacular was mostly what Fischer was engaging in and critiquing and showing. Capitalist realism is about ideologies manifested in the media and in art. So he was both on the pulse of this problem of communications, but also kind of participating in it. And I think that double consciousness, I can't speak if he knew it or not. I don't know. But the double consciousness does, when you go back and reread the Vampire Castle essay, seems there. Right. It wasn't just about communication styles or approaches to organizing. The problem he was critiquing was built into the politics of internet technologies themselves. In the Vampire Castle, Fischer focused on online left liberal politics. I would say, with some caveat, he was also talking about campuses and activist circles after Occupy. But he was seeing that this had spread throughout online left liberal politics, specifically how toxic identity politics were being used to destroy the left. But I think the Vampire Castle is bigger than just the left. Absolutely, Yasha. All politics in our world have become trapped in the Vampire Castle, trapped in endless culture wars where everyone's constantly pitted against each other, an endless fight that involves constantly evolving identity politics, fringe causes, peripheral issues, and perceived slights. All of it is addictive and destructive, all of it preventing us from coming together. All of it's encoded into algorithm to keep you on their sites more. Fischer didn't focus on the politics of technology that created the Vampire Castle, but those technological politics were there. That's because the Vampire Castle was built on social media, and the social media had been engineered to create and multiply the conflict, to trigger anger, to create division and strife, and ultimately to control and pacify us by getting us addicted to online interactions. I think that Yasha's right here, particularly by the time you get to algorithmic social media around the time Fischer wrote the Vampire Castle article. Earlier, social media was not algorithmic. It was more organic and didn't have these same kinds of problems. But you couldn't keep feeding people ads if they were only going in to check stuff for their friends. And so these algorithms became more and more important. There's some other things that we have to keep to, is like keeping profitability by having stuff go into things that were priorly not profitable. And most of these internet companies and social media companies were not profitable until a change in financial conditions made them able to suck up enough other resources to be so. And that was policy promoted by the Obama administration, not something the left could really look at. But back to Yasha. That's how these giant monopolies made money. They keep us on their platforms. Absolutely. And it got more and more pernicious. The only caveat to say what I'm going to add is Fischer thought this was also endemic to campus cultures and in very niche activist circles, but that had been able to split out. So the Vampire Castle was like the cathedral in Yarvin or in Nick Land. But unlike the cathedral, it had spread out to the general world. It wasn't just elites anymore. This kind of virtual sociality has become central to our political culture. The social media is where most of our politics and political actions take place. Unfortunately, yes. I mean, hell, the president of the United States is addicted to social media. It's funny because I remember when Obama got in trouble for having, it was a political debate when he had a BlackBerry. The amount of social media use with the presidency is hilarious in that regard. It has its own social media platform, and his former buddy Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, is so addicted on social media and bought a platform to promote his ideas. Now they're ridiculously dueling with each other from the safety of their own social media castles. So yeah, social media is central to politics. In some way, the virtual world is now the real world. From the lowest peon to the mightiest capitalist, we all live in it and are affected by it and shaped by it. It's true that social media did not invent political infighting and petty conflict, but the internet has allowed it to be pushed on us to an unprecedented scale, and we are bombarded by the cultural war slop 24/7. I mean, every day, all the time, constantly. It's tuned specifically to our interests, and it comes at us when we don't want it. I mean, it's all over every fandom, it's all over everything else, and it's part of the way fandoms market themselves and corporations market shows now, or movies, whatever, music, go with it. When we are commuting to work, while we're on the toilet, while we're hanging out on the playground with our kids, we just want to check our emails. And if you take a step back and look at it coldly, like a future historian studying us 200 years from now would, it would be very clear that these systems were designed to have us at each other's throat because it keeps us on the platform. I'm adding that, but it's obvious. Designed to preemptively smother any attempt of coming together. And in fact, you don't have to be a future historian to see the trends. In my book, Surveillance Valley, I told the forgotten history of how the internet was born out of the Pentagon's pacification efforts during the Vietnam War. Very important. Thank you, Yasha. And the more I look at the internet today, the more I'm convinced that the pacification dimension of this technology is still with us today. Absolutely. Although it's harder to control. It cuts in multiple directions, but I don't think it's ultimately pacifying. But it might lead to stochastic terrorism. But no material social forces really holding that terrorism together, which is a bizarre thing to argue and see. That was also cooked up by by former intelligence agents attached to the military. I can tell you the story of leaderless resistance and how it went from anti-communist planners into the left and then into the far right at the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, and is now everywhere. All right, back to this. And even more powerful than anything that America's technocratic planners envisioned half a century ago. When they were building out the early internet and crunching surveillance files on Thai hill tribes, Vietnamese peasants, and the American anti-war protesters. To bring it back to Mark Fisher, yeah, our culture of petty political conflict and division is a problem, but this culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. Thank God you are pointing this out, Yasha. Thank you. This culture has been shaped and influenced by internet technology and by other technologies prior. It was shaped and influenced by media technologies. It was shaped and influenced by campus cultures and the way campus cultures are structured. This is a long trend going back to stuff Marshall McLuhan was talking about, but the internet specifically honed in on it and made it so much more effective and targeted and constant than anything priorly could have done. We never asked for this tech, and yet it was foisted on us. I mean, we kind of asked for the World Wide Web, but whatever. It has long reorganized our culture and our politics and our world, and literally can change as long as we're plugged into it. And I'm convinced that we can't exit the vampire castle without physically exiting the technology out of which it was built. We have to realize that the technology was a politics of its own, and we can never fully escape its politics as long as we live within that technology engrossed in our phones. Thinking you can win within the vampire's castle is what entraps you even more, and what makes it a vampire's castle. Now, I want to hear about the spectacular in this from Yasha, but we'll come back to that. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more behind this. And I feel weird saying this when I'm like 90% agreeing with this article about how the internet is destroying everything, but I'm not a social media platform, so just make of that what you will. Take care.